we're gonna go live, and we're gonna talk about whatever you guys want to talk about, parenting a pandemic, or some of the comments that have been popping up on some of my posts lately, specifically about a lot of people say like, oh my God, that's me, what you're describing is me, that, auditory hypersensitivity, or analysis paralysis, or other whatever, anxiety, drawing a blank. What was the other one? Reoccurring like traumatic thoughts, or like intrusive thoughts, that's the word. Everyone's saying like, it me. And like, yeah, for sure. That's why I post it, right? Because so many of us struggle with these kinds of things, and it's just like, for some reason, not really something that we talk about a lot. It's not something that I've really ever like talked about with my friends or family or anything like that, aside from like maybe my partner. But other than that, like, we kind of just suffer in silence, and we have these like thoughts or these feelings or these reactions, and we tend to feel a lot of guilt for it, and we feel like we're bad, or we're wrong, or we're doing something wrong, and that's not really the case. And I think it's really important for people to comment and to have those kinds of videos, on there. The TikTok algorithm really gets it, and to really like see those and comment on them, and just create some community around some of the shitty things that we experience that are obviously heightened because we're in a pandemic and stress levels are like hella high. So one of the questions that I get a lot is like, okay, that's me, so now what? Obviously, like, there's no way that I could provide feedback on an individual basis for like how you specifically can overcome whatever it is that's your specific challenge. And I don't think that's really the purpose of TikTok. TikTok's not therapy. But I think what's really important, and the purpose of it, is really to get us talking and to get awareness, out there, and for us to be just thinking about some of these things that are, I don't want to say they're universal experiences, because certainly not everyone can empathize or relate to, some of the things that I've been posting about, but certainly like millions of you can, evidenced by the fact that there's like millions of likes and views on so many of these TikToks that I honestly just thought I would pump out and like get a couple hundred views, and it's been amazing. So I think when people say, well, what do I do now? Oh, you talk about all these things, and then you don't give us, what to do. And I think like, I'm happy to answer questions if you have any, but at the end of the day, like, you would really need to see a therapist or see a coach or whoever it is, depending on what your need is. If you struggle with executive dysfunction, if you struggle with ADHD, anxiety, mental health issues, or just like general parenting stress, definitely reach out to someone. If you're interested in my 2 cents, if I know anybody in your area, obviously I'm happy to send you their way. I'm in Ontario, Canada, so you guys are probably all over the world, so I don't necessarily have contacts in all of your regions, but I'm happy to at least point you in the direction of a kind of professional that might be able to help, whether it's like a psychologist or like a coach, like I said. Not everything, though, needs to be fixed or to be solved when it comes to, some of our struggles. A lot of the time it's really just about like having that community come together and be like, oh, shared experience, and recognize that there are things that we're all experiencing together. And I think knowing that self-awareness piece is always step one when it comes to figuring out how, how to move forward and all of that. And I think whenever you do, even when you work with a therapist, a lot of the time you start with knowing yourself and that self-awareness, that self-reflection piece. When we do CBT, it's called the psychoeducation piece. So it's like where you're learning, you're learning about yourself, about your brain. And I think that's what's really cool about being able to identify with posts like this on TikTok that really just like speak to you, and you're like, oh my God, there's actually a name for what I'm experiencing. And that, I think for me, that's the point, that's the value that it brings, is giving you guys the know-how to say, oh my God, that's me. And not only is that me, but that's a lot of other people, and that's, like, for lack of a better way to describe it, normal. And obviously there are strategies you can use. You don't just have to suffer in silence, or suffer alongside your the millions of other people on TikTok who are like, that's me. But I think the point is not necessarily to fix the issues, just to recognize them, and then to be able to develop coping mechanisms and adaptive skills that help you do what you need to do on a day-to-day basis. If it's auditory sensitivity, like sensitivity to sound, then like what are some proactive ways you can manage that? You're probably not going to fix that. It doesn't really need to be fixed. It's just a sensitivity. It's just a different way of processing sensory input. So, you know, you might notice that when you're stressed, you're more reactive, and, you know, when you're relaxed or baseline or mellow, you're less reactive. It's pretty normal and pretty common, I would say, as well. So it's not necessarily about fixing the problem, but just about recognizing that you have it and being able to articulate it properly, and perhaps more importantly, being able to identify it in the moment. Like, you're not just like having a freak out for no reason. You're overwhelmed. Your senses are overwhelmed. So if you know that it's, let's say, auditory input or sound that's bothering you, then, you know, you can go ahead and turn down the sound, whether that's like, you know, the volume on your kids, the volume on your, you know, your partner, the volume on the TV, the radio, whatever it is, that kind of thing. You know, the other thing that I think a lot of people are identifying with these days is that tendency to not be able to regulate until you peak. So I talk a lot with my clients who are mostly parents of children, but I mean, this applies for adults as well, but I think it becomes a learned behavior for all of us that starts in childhood. So I always talk to my clients about it with reference to their kids. So like, for example, like this is on my desk, so I'm going to use it. This is my son's. So like, kids get used to climbing the slow escalation continuum, right? So an escalation continuum is like your low levels of, escalation emotions, that kind of thing, that eventually hit a point and peak. So like, I don't know, let's say your regular is like a level 1, if we want to give it numbers. So like, you start at a level 1 and that's where you are. And then as you become more and more irritated or aggravated or overwhelmed, you climb, then you go to level 2, level 3, level 4. And then let's say a 5 is like your top, where you're like losing your shit and your kid is losing their shit. It's like full meltdown mode. That's up here. So like, you kind of ride this continuum, and once you start to recognize your early cues, you can predict it. So when you start to see those early cues of escalation in your kid, like let's say auditory hypersensitivity or sensitivity to sound, light, smell, whatever it is, you can start to say, oh, we're climbing that continuum. Let's use some strategies. Let's regroup, let's pivot, let's take a break, let's whatever. But what happens a lot of the time is that we climb this continuum, and if we don't recognize these subtle levels of escalation, then we don't regulate until we peak. And then we come down the other end. And so then we go like level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5. And then we hit our level 5, we peak. It lasts for however long it lasts for. You might kind of like chill at level 5 like that. And then ultimately you go back down, level 4, level 3, level 2, level 1. The problem with that is that it kind of teaches your body and your mind that the only way to, get over that level of escalation is to ride it out and then go back down the other end. When in reality, if you utilize coping mechanisms, which, you would be cued to do that when you see those low levels of escalation, like auditory sensitivity, or, having a shorter fuse, or whatever it is for you that you could outline at each various level, that gives you a little cue, and that says, hey, you need to use some strategies, and let's use some strategies so that, let's say at level 3, when I notice that I'm here, I can actually use some strategies and then go to level 2 and level 1 without having to peak. The problem is when we don't do that, and we don't recognize those lower levels of escalation, and we don't use a strategy when we need to, before we're like at like the crisis point, then we sort of train our bodies and we train our mind that we really need to lose our shit in order to regulate. And so what happens is, the more we practice doing that, the more we go from 0 to 100 quickly, because we have sort of subconsciously learned, or through behavior patterns, that we actually need to hit our peak in order to regulate. So you'll find, I've had clients before where they actually couldn't regulate until they hit their complete peak, because they had done it so many times. So many times they had not been able to regulate until they just lost their shit. And then they essentially, whether it's a kid who's like having a tantrum, a full-blown meltdown, screaming, hitting, crying, getting it all out. And then once it's all out, then they can slowly start to regulate. What we want to do is prevent that. We want to prevent that, level 5 escalation in ourselves, and obviously in our kids as well. So we want to be recognizing these lower levels of escalation. For some of us, that might be auditory hypersensitivity. That might be, whatever it is for you, having a shorter fuse. It might be, a certain tone of voice that you use. All of these things that would vary for you as the parent, or for your kiddo, depending on, you might notice that your kiddo starts to talk with a certain tone, or starts to be a little more sassy, or starts to, it could be like physical symptoms as well of, escalation, flushed cheeks, sweating, all of that. So these are all possibilities. It could be, behavioral, or it could be like physical, that you can actually concretely see. It could be internal. It could be like, you know, I start to feel warm. I start to feel, you know, my stomach kind of starts to like do the wave. And what's important is that we are able to identify each of these cues for ourselves, and sort of plot them along our escalation continuum, so that we can be like, oh crap, like if I'm normally like here with my little alligator at like level 1, where I'm like cool, calm, and collected, and like, you know, all the parts of my brain are working together, the logical and emotional parts are just like really killing it and working together. And then I start to notice that like I start to become a little bit short, or something happens that cues me, that says, okay, like I'm not exactly regulated anymore. Better to use a strategy here at this level than to wait until you get up to this level where, you know, you ultimately need to peak and then come down a lot slower. It's really important for our kids to learn that about themselves as well. And it's not something that you could do like in a class. It has to be individualized. So like you wouldn't learn this in school, because everybody's escalation continuum is a little different. So it really does need to be done on sort of a one-on-one, and you can do it sort of as self-reflection for yourself. And you can also coach your kiddo through that as well, and it can be really helpful. You know, you can say things like, you know, I noticed that, you know, when you have to share and you don't want to, you X, Y, Z. You know, how do you think that, you know, tells us about what you're feeling and what you're thinking and that kind of thing, so that they can recognize those different signs in themselves. And I think a lot of the videos for me that have gone like really viral on TikTok are the videos that represent different levels of escalation on people's escalation continuum. So like, for example, the one about sensory defensiveness and sensory sensitivity, where, you know, I talked about people being like touched out, peopled out, you know, all that stuff, just like basically like depleted at the end of the day. For a lot of people, that might be pretty close to the top of their, you know, their crisis level, like their burnout level. You know, that could be like a level 4 or level 5 for them. That could be a level 4, and then the next step could be like total, you know, grown-up meltdown, where, you know, you're crying and you're inconsolable and you can't really regulate until you get it all out. Obviously that's fine, and feeling all the feelings is fine, but, you know, it's much better for us if we're able to proactively use strategies, so that like instead of our, you know, we're always riding the waves of emotion. That's an analogy that I use a lot. We're just like riding the waves, but like better for our waves to be like kind of low and slow than to be like these like really crazy like tsunami waves where like, you know, we're peaking and then we're coming down and we're peaking, because I mean the reality is that's really hard on us. It's exhausting mentally, physically, and you know there's other factors as well, like, you know, the more stressed you are, the more cortisol you release. It's like a whole thing. It's like a whole body mind thing that we don't want. We don't want our bodies to get used to having to hit that like peak of our escalation continuum in order to regulate. We want to be able to regulate whenever we need to. We don't want to have to like, you know, flip our lid or lose our shit when we do that. I'm going to go through a couple comments and then I'll just continue a little. I think that's me. How do you regulate? I'm not sure which part you were saying was you. Sorry, I wasn't quick enough on it. I think the way that you regulate really depends on who you are. So something that I do with my clients, my kiddos, and I also, honestly, I do this with myself, and I do this sometimes with my staff members, because our job is really stressful as therapists, and we need to really be self-aware, and we need to always be doing work on ourselves. And I think it applies to parents as well. So something you can do is like on a 1 to 5 scale, map out what you look like and what you feel like at each level. So a 5 is like you're losing your shit level, and a 1 is like your mostly regular level, baseline level. What does it look like and what do you feel like at each level? And then what can you do in order to, you know, regulate in that moment? Because even if we're calm and cool and collected and at like a level 1, we still need to proactively regulate, because if we don't, we won't stay at that level. You know, we want to be implementing these strategies throughout our day and not just contingent on, you know, like flipping our lid or losing it or, you know, hitting our peak. So I can't say what that would look like for you, obviously, without knowing you better, but I can say just generally, you know, plot out what you look like at various levels of your escalation. You know, for some people, we do like up to 10 levels. You know, some people might have very subtle changes, and others might have much more drastic changes. So that can be important. So it's going to be like, I don't know, picture like 3 columns. So it's like your numbers, what you look like at each number, and then what you can do. So if I'm at a number 2 and I like want to get back to a number 1, here are some strategies I can use. And it can literally be anything, like whatever works for you, whatever regulates you. It could be movement, it could be water, it could be eating, drinking, you know, listening to your favorite song, like anything that works for you in terms of coping mechanisms. I wouldn't be able to, you know, suggest that without knowing you better, but you can honestly just Google, like, you know, coping strategies, and I'm sure you'll find some. It can be fidgeting. It can be whatever satisfies whatever you need in that moment. Son is a sensory seeker. Yeah, that is exhausting for sure. I think clear boundaries around when you're able to provide sensory input and when you're not. And also I would say it's really important for your kiddo to have his sensory needs met as well, but it's totally valid for you to place boundaries around where they can be met. So, that level of volume is too high for this room, you can do that level of volume in that room. Or, that level of like activity, physical activity, because sometimes a sensory seeker is like buzzing, and it can really bring up the energy in a room. That level of energy or physical energy is for outside. It's for the backyard, or it's for the park, or it's for the basement, or it's for wherever it is. So certainly let them get the sensory input they need, but it's okay to put boundaries around, what we can do where. That's reasonable. That's regular kid and parenting stuff. Do I have tips for a new therapist? So many. I think one of the best pieces of advice that I ever got from, I don't know if it's the best piece of advice, but something that has always stuck with me from the psychologist that I originally trained under, was I was struggling a lot to problem solve and strategize initially with some of my clients. And I really was feeling like I was wearing the burden of that. And if things weren't working, I was really feeling, like guilty about it. And I was really feeling like I just needed to make immediate change. And I think one of the pieces of advice that was really helpful for me was, my supervisor said, it's really important for you to do the best you can for your clients, but in order for you to service them and to serve them as best you can and be able to meet their needs when they need it, when you're in session with them, and also in terms of preparing before the session, you need to be able to detach, and you need to be able to not wear their burden. You can hold space, and you can, support them, of course, but you need to be able to detach so that you're not walking around carrying the burden of all of the clients at the same time that you support, because then you can't recharge, and then you don't have any room left in your mind to strategize and problem solve logically, because you're thinking too sort of emotionally, and you're not accessing the parts of your brain that you need. For me, that was really helpful when I initially started, because I think there's a tendency to just want to fix, for lack of a better word. And even though we know intuitively that therapists don't fix, that's not their job, but there is this sense that we need to be able to provide value, of course. And a lot of the time, our job is really just to hold space and to, help our clients get to where they need to be through, working through things together, but not necessarily guiding. We're not leading. We're collaborating, and I'm, giving my insight, and they're giving their insight, and we're working together. And I think when you take away that need to fix, and you stop viewing your role as fixing and more as, supporting, I think that goes a long way in terms of being able to turn off at the end of the day and then come back the next day fresh with like mental space and mental capacity. Getting overstimulated as a parent. Yeah, a lot of parents thought, oh, that's me for getting overstimulated for sure. That's what I was initially saying. It's like literally millions of you were like, oh my God, I didn't know that was a thing. And then there's people that, ADHD and autistic folks who are like, yeah, obviously that's a thing. Like that's been a thing. So, there's two sides of that. And I think some people are more affected by sensory sensitivity than others. And some people are more aware that it exists than others. A lot of us live in this world where like sensory needs aren't really talked about, which is bizarre to me, but that's because I live in a, world of supporting neurodivergent kids and their families. So sensory stuff is like, 90% of what we talk about. Do I have any advice for a parent? When do I get overstimulated and anxious? When I get overstimulated and anxious, again, I think it really just depends on the context. I think anytime you can use proactive strategies to manage your own anxiety, it's going to be really helpful. And I think anytime you can, spend a little time on self-awareness and just getting to know your own, like your levels of escalation, like I talked about initially, and just really knowing what makes you tick, like knowing your triggers and knowing that, certain things are more likely to push you over the edge than the other. And maybe you have, I think time, having what we call like a temporal context. So like, understanding of time and how time affects our anxiety and like our stress levels. So like, for example, in my practice, we take a lot of data, and there's different reasons we take data, but one thing that has been really helpful for me in terms of planning and getting a sense of what the big picture is around anxiety behavior is getting a sense of when it likely occurs in terms of time of day. Of course, I want to know like what's happening just before in the environment in terms of like trigger, but I also want to know like, are there any trends in the time of day? Like, are you frequently stressed out around dinner time? For me, that's like that's a tough time in my house because, there's cooking going on. My kids are probably on screens because I'm trying to get cooking done. I have a baby. So like there's a lot going on at that time. And like I found myself, if I don't use the right strategies, like dreading that time and then realizing that like I'm shorter and like, all these things that are just indicating to me that like I'm struggling at that time. And I've noticed that like dinner time, whatever hour that is, tends to be a trigger. And so as a result, I would use that information and just like be more proactive about using strategies before, or just like, frankly, cut myself some slack and like, have a glass of wine, have a drink, like whatever I need to do, just to like, ride it out and know that like I can cut myself some slack. I don't need to nail everything all at once. I only need to, nail, one thing at a time. I don't know if that's helpful, but again, like I don't know you guys, so this isn't therapy. This is just me, spitballing ideas in terms of what might work. Advice for a highly sensitive 6-year-old. I would need so much more information in terms of like ideas. I think if you're dealing with a kiddo who's sensitive, you really just want to focus on self-awareness, self-regulation, and you want to make sure that you're parenting consistently. Something that's extremely stressful for all kids, but especially sensitive kids, is if we're not parenting consistently. So if one day I can do this behavior and then get this thing, and then the other day I do this behavior and this is the consequence, that can be really stressful. Kids need to be able to predict the outcome of their actions in order to manage their stress and their anxiety. So a kiddo who's, super sensitive and showing you that like they're emotional or whatever it is, that may be an indicator that there needs to be a little more consistency and routine in the environment. You're welcome. The witching hour. Yeah. Okay. That's really funny. I was doing an Instagram video the other day and I did like a pan of the room I was in, and it was like chaos. Like I have 3 kids, they were all being wild. And I said something like, oh, it's the witching hour, like welcome to the witching hour. And my 5-year-old daughter thought that was really funny, and thought I was talking about witches. So be careful what you say around your kids. Any tips on explosive children? A gazillion. What specifically do you want to know in terms of what? Generally love them, teach them, work on behavior. Consistent behavioral responses is like top notch. Like you need to do that. You need to be parenting, teaching, therapizing, whatever your role is, consistently. And if you're not, that's super stressful for kids, and it's just going to make behavior, difficult behavior worse. ADHD, so I'm consistently inconsistent. So I think here's the thing. I love talking to parents about behavior because there's this misconception that parents think like, I need to, in order to be consistent, I need to respond to the behavior the same way every time. That's not true. That's not what consistency means. If I hit, in one setting, that might be communicating one thing, versus if I hit in another setting, that could be communicating something completely different. So when we're saying, you need to be consistent, you're not consistent based on what you see. You're not consistent based on the behavior. You're consistent in responding to the function or the meaning behind the behavior. What is the behavior communicating? And then you respond accordingly. So you might respond 5 different ways to 5 different occurrences of hitting, because what the hitting is trying to say is different each time. That I think is a big misconception. So when we talk about being consistent, it doesn't mean, okay, every time your kid hits, you're going to put them in timeout. First of all, don't use timeout unless you really know what you're doing, number one. And number two, that's not going to work because hitting is a behavior and behavior communicates. And if you don't understand what the hitting is communicating and you're just responding with a blanket, timeout because you're like, consistency, that's what consistency is. And if I'm not consistent, then what am I? Then you're missing the mark. So it's not necessarily the case that you need to, prescribe a consequence-based strategy for every observable behavior. Every time you hit, you will get this. Every time you kick, you will get this. It doesn't work like that, because not only do we need to be responding to behaviors, but we need to be figuring out what they mean, because number one, if we don't know how to respond, and number two, we need to be able to teach them a better way to tell me what they want. So if you hit me because I told you have to get dressed, and I put you in timeout, well, that worked. You hitting me sent the message, I don't want to get dressed. And then I'm like, oh, that's it, timeout. Okay, well, now you don't have to get dressed. So that worked. So now they're going to try that hitting again next time. Versus, if they hit you and you say it's time to get dressed, and they hit you and you say, don't hit me, get dressed. You address the issue and then you follow through. So the behavior doesn't serve the purpose. And then they're going to be like, okay, well, what can I do next time if I don't want to get dressed? Well, you can say, I don't want to get dressed. And then in that case, I might say, oh my God, I love how you used your words and told me what you want instead of hitting me or kicking me or throwing yourself on the ground or throwing your pajamas at me. I love that. And you know what? Let's how about 5 more minutes? Or you might say, oh my God, I love how you used your words. That was so awesome. We're still getting dressed, but nice job using your words to tell me what you want. I'm really proud of you. That's awesome. If you don't know what the behavior itself is communicating, you can't possibly respond appropriately. So in that sense, get a sense of what the behavior means and is saying, and then tackle it from a communication perspective. When you don't do that, you're just blindly punishing, basically. And punishment is very rarely the call, in my humble opinion, and science will back me up on that. Science, I was going to say science is a last resort. No, science is a first resort. Punishment is a last resort. And it's only something that you would go to once you've tried like all the other options. And oftentimes, even when you do go to it because you've exhausted all your other options, it's not as effective as antecedent or proactive strategies, or strategies that address like what the deficit is. Like, okay, if you're hitting me because I said, get dressed, and so you hit me. What's the issue here? What's the deficit? Like, is the deficit communication? You don't have the skills to say, I don't want to get dressed. Is the deficit like, you're feeling like all I ever do is tell you that, you have to do things. So the deficit is in like relationship and connection. You want my attention, or is the deficit in like, a skill related to the task I'm asking you to do? Can you get dressed? Can you, whatever, like, do you hate buttons and you don't want to, get dressed because of buttons? Do you hate the fabric? Whatever. What's the deficit, essentially? Opinions. Tips on explosive children in session, therapy-wise, or forgiving tips to parents. Generally, I would say 2 things. One, the science of behavior is your friend. It's evidence-based. It alone is not the answer, in my humble opinion. Again, you need to know about trauma if you're dealing with kids that are explosive. I think you need to know about trauma if you're dealing with kids in general, but in particular if you're dealing with kids that are explosive. And I also want to know, like, what do you mean by explosive in the sense that, explosive tends to mean like high rates of behavior. So I want to know a lot more. I want to know what's going on in the family situation. I want to know how our parents parenting. I want to know if there's trauma. I want to know all those things in order to be able to give strategies. And I think when you're supporting a kid whose behavior is described by other people as explosive, you essentially want to look at the science of behavior. Like I said, behavior science. You want to think about the 3-term contingency. So you want to think about what's happening before, what could be possibly triggering it or setting it off, what the behavior is itself, what does it look like, how do you measure it, and then what happens after. And I think a common misconception is the what happens after piece. So that's like our ABC continuum. So what happens after the behavior is like the consequence. And it's a common misconception that a consequence has to be a punishment. It's not necessarily the case. Like, for example, I see a cookie, I eat the cookie, I'm full. That's a 3-term contingency. I see the cookie, that's what happens before. I eat the cookie, that's the behavior. And then the consequence or what follows is that I'm full. So I think look at the behavior through that lens and not necessarily through the lens of like what punishment is following from it. That's not necessarily the case. And a lot of the time, like I said, when it comes to escalation of kids, they ride the wave really intensely, and then they hit that peak, and then they can't regulate until they come back down the other end. So with kids who are described as explosive, I also want to be looking at self-regulation and self-awareness and use of coping mechanisms. Step one, minute one, I want to know about possible trauma. I want to know about what's going on in the home. And I also think it's important to know that like trauma doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't necessarily mean like living through a war. It doesn't necessarily mean, like death of a family member. Like trauma can be very nuanced. So it can be, moving a lot. It can be like living through a pandemic. It can be, inconsistencies in parenting that, create a rift in the relationship between the caregiver and the kiddo. All those things. In therapy, the only thing I can say is you always want to start with rapport building. You never want to strategize until you have a rapport, because you don't know, even from a goal setting standpoint, you don't know what the kid is capable, or even the client, even if it's an adult, you don't know what they're capable of until you have a rapport with them. And you can determine that they're for sure comfortable with you and giving you like the best picture. Thank you. 4 kids, 1 with ASD, 1 with ADHD, 1 with SPD. Awesome. I'm glad they're super helpful for you. Your family's my jam. That's my jam. I love neurodivergent kids. I love kids with ASD. I love ADHD kids. I love kids with SPD. That's my niche for sure. Most of my clients have one or all of those needs. And parenting is complicated in general, and even more so when your kiddos are complex, and especially if you're a neurotypical parent parenting neurodivergent kids. It really makes you challenge everything you know about the world, and we like to think as grown-ups that we know a lot and that we can empathize and can put ourselves in other people's shoes, but a lot of the time we really, really struggle to see the world through the eyes of someone whose brain works a little differently. All right. I think that's it. My live has been reported for violating. I'm sorry that somebody feels I'm violating something. All right, guys, that's it. Have a good one.